Welcome to the American Security Project. My name is Joshua Faust. I'm a fellow here. I run our asymmetric operations program. So I was just going to give you a 5-second version of who and what ASP is, and then we can get right into the event. So the American Security Project was founded a couple of years ago to create nonpartisan space to have fact-based discussions of national security topics. And we take a strategic focus on these topics, trying to look at what American interests are, how we can best secure those interests, and trying to figure out empirical ways of then advancing those interests in the broader public. So that's enough about us. We have a tremendous number of very high-level people here that I'm sure we're all eager to hear discuss the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and how we can actually move this discussion forward and start developing these empirical ways of talking about the two wars that we're fighting. So without any further ado, I will hand this off to Seyom Brown, and I guess we can get started.
Thank you, Josh. Thank the American Security Project for putting on this event with us. Can everybody hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Okay. This is a dialogue that started a number of years ago. We at the Tower Center at SMU, John D. Tower Center for Political Studies, where I'm the director of the program on national security and defense, assembled a group of people that we thought had the experience to tackle this very difficult subject about the lessons and legacies that we're developing from Iraq and Afghanistan, the U.S. involvement in both of those. We've continued that dialogue, and the book is just a one-way station along this effort to understand what the implications are for the United States in the future. Today's session is not necessarily about the book, it's about the subject matter. And I've asked each of our authors, one of which, by the way, can't be with us today, and that's Rob Littbaugh, but each of our authors, 4 chapters in the book, to talk with us this morning about the implications of the U.S. experience in Iraq and Afghanistan for basic U.S. foreign policy and grand strategy, to talk about the meaning for U.S. capacities for COIN, regime change operations, state-building operations, and also to draw out the implications for roles and missions and budgets of the various U.S. national security agencies that the legacy and the lessons bring forward. I don't know what my colleagues are going to say because we're asking them to take a fresh look at these issues. In the book, they did an analysis in depth of some special aspects of it, but they were all told before coming today that they could deal with any of these subject matters in 5 minutes for openers that we're all going to be discussing. I will introduce them in turn, but first, although I'm one of the editors, along with Bob Scales being one of the editors, I am dropping my stance of neutrality as an editor and will give you my take on what the legacies and lessons are briefly for openers. I think it's been well captured, that is the significance, the implications have been well captured by Robert Gates in his valedictory at West Point when he said that any future defense secretary who advises the president to again send a big American land army into Asia or the Middle East should have his head examined, as General MacArthur so delicately put it. Which is a conclusion derived in large measure from our experience with the second question about U.S. capabilities for regime change operations, that type of COIN, nation-state building, which does require a big land army. We can do counterterrorism with drones and special ops, but COIN requires a heavy footprint, a boots-on-the-ground footprint. So what are the lessons of the 2 COIN regime change type operations, state-building operations? First, we're not very good at such operations, even when welcomed as liberators. Second, successful COIN does require successful state building. In other words, a requisite of security is viable governance. Note I didn't say legitimate governance. And a requisite of governance is human security. So there are problems. Forms of government that are viable, sustainable, need to be largely compatible with traditional indigenous cultural norms and structures, which are, in places we might be tempted to intervene, most often hierarchical, ascriptive, and corrupt. Our friends, local allies, may be no better in providing such viable governance than our enemies. And neither our friends or enemies are likely to be true believers in the human rights center type of governance that we as liberators are trying to get them to adopt. As these lessons sink in, what are the national security policy and military planning implications, particularly in this era of constrained military budgets? The burden of proof, the burden of justification for those recommending engaging in COIN state-building missions will be much, much heavier than it has been in the past. In short, COIN state-building missions will be marginal, not central, to our basic national security policy and grand strategy, not the core of it, as was widely assumed during the first decade of the 21st century. And we already see this effect in the new national strategy assessments, national strategy announcements and guidance, which despite their rhetorical endorsement of a full spectrum of capabilities or a broad portfolio of capabilities, they exhibit a strong inclination to base U.S. military planning primarily on the premises of the command of the commons and offshore balancing schools. This appears to me where we are headed. Okay. None of the missions of the forces that Vanda listed in his January guidance document, in none of those is a central place given to counterinsurgency. And counterinsurgency and stability operations come 9th in a list of 10th. Okay. And then, in italics, the Secretary of Defense says, however, U.S. forces will no longer be sized to conduct large-scale, prolonged stability operations. I suggest to you that this is the legacy that we have to live with. And I put it to my colleagues to give their own interpretation of where we now are in defense planning, in national security policy, as a result of our involvement in these two operations. First, I'd like to turn to Dan Caldwell. Dan is a distinguished professor at Pepperdine University. He's written widely on U.S. foreign policy and national security subjects. Dan.
All right, thank you. I'd like to start by thanking Seyom and Bob Scales, the co-editors of the book, also the American Security Project for hosting this meeting, and Len Novak, who is in the room some over here, who organized all of this and kept us going. And then lastly, in absentia, Jim Hollifield, who's the director of the Tower Center at SMU and the series editor, of which this book is the inaugural edition. Seyom, I'd also like to note that I noted a typo apparently in an email that you sent to us. You said we had 5 minutes, and yet all of us have taught before. We're taught in graduate school only to speak for 50-minute chunks. So I calculate that we'll be here for 7.5 hours. I'm sure all of you look forward to that.
1/10 the usual.
In the 4 minutes I have left, I'd like to comment on really some lessons that can be learned from one war to the other, from Iraq to Afghanistan or vice versa. And I'd like to focus on 4 different aspects of that. First, the so-called light footprint approach. Secondly, the application of the surge of troops in both Afghanistan and Iraq. Third, flipping the Sunni tribesmen in Iraq and the Taliban in Afghanistan. And then lastly, as I think a recognition that the United States enemies have learned from these two wars as well, I'd like to focus on improvised explosive devices. And I'll do that very quickly, and we can come back to some of them if you have questions about that. First, on the light footprint approach. I think as all of you realize, the United States invaded Afghanistan on October the 7th, 2001, with a little more than 400 special forces and CIA operatives in Afghanistan. And in a very short period of time, those 400 special operators, working with the Northern Alliance on the ground and American air power, were able to destroy the Al-Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan and to overthrow the Taliban government. That success, remarkable military success, I think led Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld to conclude that his highly touted revolution in military affairs worked, and that it worked spectacularly well in Afghanistan. So when the administration then began planning and thinking about invading Iraq, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, others in the administration said, well, the light footprint approach worked in Afghanistan, won't it work in Iraq? And contrary to the advice of the top leadership of the Army in particular, and also the Marines, top generals were estimating it would take a minimum of 300,000 forces up to 500,000 forces to successfully invade Iraq. The administration chose to send 150,000. When that didn't work out so well in Iraq by 2006, President Bush then went back to square one and decided to send another 30,000 American troops to Iraq. And Ambassador Ryan Crocker, whom I interviewed, said that in 2006, the United States was on the verge of defeat in Iraq. The surge turned that around, and while it may not have achieved American victory in Iraq, it did prevent decisive American defeat. President Obama comes into office, and he had been critical of both the involvements of the United States in Afghanistan and Iraq, but after his 6-week study, he concluded, in fact, that a surge could be applied to Afghanistan. So a page was taken out of the Bush administration's playbook in applying the surge to Afghanistan. The other part of the surge, however, was co-opting Sunni tribesmen, flipping them from being opponents to the United States to supporting the United States. And that was successful, largely because of monetary incentives. The United States paid 100,000 Sunni tribesmen $300 a month to essentially not shoot at and kill American and coalition forces. As the United States applied the surge in Afghanistan, the missing piece was flipping American enemies in Afghanistan. And of course, the most likely candidates for being flipped were members of the Taliban. And to date, that's been very problematic. A little more than 3,000 have undergone the sort of re-education programs in Afghanistan, which is far below what the United States was expecting and hoping for. And the last point that I'll make, it refers to improvised explosive devices. IEDs were used first in Iraq, and now they have been used extensively, obviously, in Afghanistan. Essentially, the IED approach was exported from Iraq into Afghanistan. And I think it illustrates the way in which the United States enemies have also learned from these two wars. My bottom line in my writing and my work on this subject is that the two wars are integrally related. They are obviously different, and yet I think future historians, and I think this book illustrates this point pretty well, that the two wars are integrally related, and it's hard to think about one war without considering the other.
Thanks very much, Dan. I'd next like to call on Linda Robinson, a distinguished scholarly journalist. She's been an Eaton Fellow at Harvard, working on political conflict, insurgencies, counterinsurgency, various books, as well as articles. Marvelous title for one of her books is Tell Me How This Ends, General Petraeus and the Search for a Way Out of Iraq. Okay. Another one is Masters of Chaos, The Secret History of Special Forces. She's now working on a book on Afghanistan. She's at the Council on Foreign Relations and sharing her time also at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Linda?
Thank you, Sam, and thank you for having us here to have this follow-on discussion. I will give you a few bullet points really in this 5-minute limit, and we can follow up on anything that is of interest to the group. In terms of the broad lessons and the broad questions that Sam laid out, I think a very important lesson from this last decade is that we could not, in fact, fight 2 wars at once, and that was the planning construct for the U.S. military. I think another lesson is we do not do the political diplomatic end games well, and we need to take that seriously. COIN is mostly about tactics and operational design, and it must be harnessed to a strategy, which is a different issue. And I think that anyone, certainly the folks from the special operations community that were my first subjects, counterinsurgency really must be conducted primarily by the country under attack. And I hope we have learned that. Every insurgency, and therefore every counterinsurgency, is different. And that difference supersedes any of the similarities. With regard to the new defense strategic guidance, I do think we're headed to the era of a small footprint approach. I don't think the U.S. has had the luxury of choosing every conflict it gets involved in. I think sometimes circumstances just push the U.S. to get involved. We'll see how Syria plays out, just as a for example. And I think that part of the task here will be for some portions of the U.S. Army, certainly Special Operations Forces, and some portion of the Marine Corps to be the keepers of the flame of how to conduct these campaigns. Also, though, the civilian side of the government, we have to face up to the fact, I think, that the development piece is very broken. And I take exception to this state-building assumption. It's really about reaching some kind of political, viable political, stable equation. I think we've gone overboard in trying to construct from the bottom up states when the country's history and culture is really going to dictate the pace of change there. And I think that trying to find market economy solutions to development as opposed to just pumping money into places, which is what we've done very egregiously in the case of Afghanistan. I think we've got to have a new development model. And governance, which again, I think it's more about politics than governance, but we cannot have civilians on the ground out there in these conflicts unless the regional security officers are not allowed to dictate where the civilians may go. I know this is a down in the weeds comment, but it's very important because the embassy is now ruled by and large by the regional security officer who dictates whether and when a civilian can get out into the field, and that really hampers any meaningful kind of civil-military cooperation down at this operational tactical level. I'll take a couple minutes to make a few comments about Iraq and Afghanistan. I believe the large scale, the large footprint or big coin approach there was probably necessary by the time we reached this 2006 period that you alluded to, where it was a full-blown civil war really, and the host nation government could not be the primary actor because it was a party to the conflict. And therefore, I think the U.S. role largely was one of separating the warring parties and then applying what were really unconventional warfare tactics to flip insurgents and create some local defense groups. So you might even want to look at this as kind of a peace enforcement operation during that segment of the campaign. I think that there's some very strange versions that have come out more recently trying to say, well, it was the Iraqis, not the U.S. And to me, having been on the ground every year of that war, both Iraqis and Americans were active agents in what happened. Yes, the Sunnis' backs were against the wall, but I think I'm still very clear that if the U.S. Troops were not there, fanned out in the epicenter of violence in Baghdad, there would be no one for them to have come in from the cold to. The Shia-led government was simply not in a position to undertake that kind of maneuver. And of course, the political diplomatic endgame is still to be written there, and I do think geopolitics may win out in that Iraqis do not want to fall under the sway of Iran, and there is a geopolitical formula under which they will look to the U.S. and other actors in the region to balance Iran's influence in their country. So I think those of us who are still interested in endgames need to stay tuned to that. In Afghanistan, I think a small footprint there is the way to go. Perhaps the surge was necessary as a temporary measure to try to shift the momentum back to the government side. And I think now whether the Afghan National Security Forces wind up at 350 or somewhere closer to 230,000, they're now large enough that they can probably take it forward. We have, in Afghanistan, wasted a lot of this surge in the wrong places, doing the wrong things. And I think history is really going to look askance at having devoted so much of the surge to Helmand, which is not a strategic area of the war. It's a booming poppy center. Kandahar is the political center of gravity of that war. And Helmand was given twice as many troops as Kandahar. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much. A lot to chew on here. We'll get back to it during the discussion. Next, I'd like to call on Michael O'Hanlon. Most of you, unless you've had your ears plugged and eyes closed, already know who he is. I'm not going to say much about him except that he's Director of Research and a Senior Fellow at the Foreign Policy and Brookings Institution. Mike.
Thank you, Seyom. I want to make 2 points, and one of them is to build on the broad question of is coin dead, or have we fundamentally changed our views on military and strategic policy? I know we have General Scales on the panel too, who's written eloquently on this, and I think made some very good critiques of some of what the administration said. I don't disagree with those critiques. I don't disagree with what you said, Seyom, but I also just want to make one point on the other side of things, which is also look at what we're keeping in the way of force structure. We are keeping an active duty Army and an active duty Marine Corps that are larger than they were in the 1990s, even after Afghanistan's over, even with Saddam Hussein gone from Iraq, which means that you have to not only listen to our words, but look at our capabilities. And I think that the shift from coin, while it's something we would all like and prefer, as Linda said, we don't always choose. Certainly in neither Iraq nor Afghanistan did we want to admit that these had become counterinsurgencies or complex peace enforcement missions until several years in. We've got to avoid the mistake, as we made after Vietnam and now more recently, of telling ourselves we can anticipate the character of the next war. The good news here is that the military is keeping enough capability, at least in the short term, at least before sequestration, that in theory we still have enough capability to do messy operations, whatever we want to call them, even if we don't want to and don't choose them of our own volition. The bad news is we're making a little bit of a historically normal mistake that we make, which is to decide that we've had enough of this sort of conflict, so let's just move on and not do it again. And again, I really admire what General Scales has written. I would remind all of you to go look back at what I think it was a January op-ed this year.
Yeah, 7th of January.
Yeah. So anyway, that's just point one. Point two is based partly, I've had the good fortune of learning from a lot of people in this room about Afghanistan, traveling with a number of them there. And in May, I was there with Ron Newman. Vanda had been there, and you should listen to what she learned and her stories, which are incredible. And I hope we will in just a couple of minutes. But Ron and I had a good chance to talk with a lot of Afghan political leaders and talk about not only the Strategic Partnership Agreement, but the looming 2014 elections. And if there's one main thing I want to begin motivationally with this point, it's to say we talk a lot about 2014 as the year of NATO transition to Afghan security forces. That's an important transition, to be sure. There's an even bigger transition in Afghanistan that year, and it's from President Karzai to somebody else. And that transition is bigger than the transition from NATO to the Afghan security forces, in its importance and in the uncertainties that it conveys. Because we were going to leave Afghanistan at some point militarily anyway with most of our forces. We couldn't do the fighting forever for them. We had to try to turn as much of the responsibility over to Afghan forces, hoping for the best, admittedly. We can all debate whether it's rushed by a year or too slow by a year, but that basic transition by President Obama and other NATO leaders is basically a compromise of the various proposals that were out there, and it reflects some fairly standard methods in thinking about how to do counterinsurgency. The big uncertainty is who's going to replace Karzai. And if we get one of the bad guys, and there are a bunch who are thinking of running, then all bets are off as to whether we can hold on to any of the progress that we've made. On the other hand, we should never forget that as much as we see Karzai as a complex and challenging actor in Afghanistan and as many mistakes and weaknesses as he has, there actually are a number of good Afghan political leaders, and some of them are intending to think about running. Whether they have a chance is partly a question of how the Karzai political machine chooses to handle them and how the international community chooses to wield its leverage. And this gets to my one main point on this subject, and I'll be done, which is we have to start thinking hard of how do we exercise leverage over the Afghan elections of 2014. Because there's a certain political correctness that says it's their decision, keep hands off. Last time we got too involved, Holbrooke pissed off Karzai, we better not do that again. If we even voice an opinion, it's going too far. Then there's another view, which is often what the Afghan reformers say these days, which is you Americans, you have to pick sides. Because unless you pick sides and tell us who you want, we have no choice and no chance against the Karzai machine. The reality has to be somewhere in between. I don't claim to have the full answer. I'm trying to think through what I learned on this latest trip. But I think we have to send a message to Afghanistan, and you have to think about how you do this publicly, privately, etc., that if they choose the wrong person in 2014, there's no way we're even going to support a 228,000 strong security force. There's no way the United States is going to provide $5 billion a year in combined security and economic aid and keep 20,000 forces in country. It's just unthinkable if they were to choose someone like a Fahim, or even leave aside Fahim, because he's not going to win, he's a Tajik, but one of Karzai's inner circle, maybe Daoudzai, former chief of staff, or one of the Karzai brothers. One of these people, I think the chances that the United States is going to come through on these big promises and pledges is next to nil. The Congress won't allow it, if nothing else. Afghanistan's not going to have a realistic chance. On the other hand, there are some at least halfway decent people thinking of running, and I think we have to, without necessarily naming names, indicate that we would be willing to try to support them. And we may have to name some names on who is unacceptable, at least in private. We can have that debate. But anyway, I think looming is the 2014 political transition. I don't want to make it sound like everything hinges on presidential politics in Afghanistan. There are a lot of smaller things we can do in the meantime and in addition, but that big change in Afghanistan has to receive more attention than it has so far.
Thanks, Mike, for those provocative comments. Next, I'd like to turn to John Nagl, who is now a research fellow at the U.S. Naval Academy. He was for the past couple of years, 2 or 3 years, was it, the president of the Center for New American Security. And of course, many of us know John from the U.S. Army Marine Corps Counterinsurgency Field Manual. He was one of the principal authors, along with General Petraeus, of that revised field manual. Your insights, John, on the future of counterinsurgency as a grand strategy for the United States are especially related by the group.
Thanks, Ian. Deeply honored. Let me echo Dan's thanks. Thank Lynn and all the folks at Dan thanked, and save a minute or two. I'd like to start off with a word of caution. Right? The Lyndon Baines Johnson government did not think that it was going to get involved in a big counterinsurgency campaign. The George W. Bush administration certainly didn't think it was going to get involved in 2 big counterinsurgency campaigns. No American government ever thinks it's going to get involved in a big counterinsurgency campaign, but they have a disturbing habit of doing so. Steve and I were at the LBJ school late last week, and I'm reminded, and I apologize for the minor obscenity, but it is LBJ. An LBJ quote, Lyndon Johnson said, "The woman I love is the great society, but this bitch of a war in Vietnam keeps pulling me back." And I would suggest that the Obama administration would really, really like to pivot toward Asia. That's the woman they love. But this bitch of the Middle East keeps pulling them back and is likely to continue to do so. And as we sagely nod and say we're never going to get involved in any of these kind of interventions again, I would just point to the continuing drumbeat and deepening drumbeat toward intervention in Syria, and obviously that couldn't possibly go wrong. So the idea that administrations have learned and that they're going to make smart foreign policy decisions and that we're never going to need this again, wouldn't it be pretty to think so? As a result, I think we have to retain the hard relearned lessons of counterinsurgency in Iraq and in Afghanistan. Here I would say that there is some good news. The recently leaked Joint Staff study has a number of very, very smart lessons learned, many at the strategic level, problems both with the civilian administration and arguably with two civilian administrations, but also certainly inside the Department of Defense with the application of strategy, with the ability to recognize things going awry, with the ability to rapidly adapt when things do. It's interesting to contrast that study with the BDM study of Vietnam. After Vietnam, we contracted out the lessons learned process. This time, the Joint Staff did it themselves. And I think that by itself increases the chances that some of those lessons are going to stick. And from what I've seen in press reports of that study, it looks to me like they got an awful lot of the answers right. In particular, if there is one lesson that I think that we don't have right yet, it's combat advisors. The ability to help conduct security force assistance on the ground. Very soon going to be the most important thing we're doing in Afghanistan, certainly for conventional forces. Conventional ground forces, the Air Force and Special Forces are obviously going to continue to have very important roles there. I was at Fort Bliss last week talking with some of the folks we're sending over for that mission. We're doing better than we were when I was training them myself at Fort Riley, Kansas, 06 to 08, but perhaps not quite good enough yet. And as the Army flails to find a post-Afghanistan mission, press reports today that countering WMD is going to be that mission. I would encourage the Army to think hard, real hard, about security forces assistance as its post-Afghanistan missions man its seat supply and will continue to. Finally, one question Seyom asked us to think about. There's been an extraordinary failure to build civilian capacity despite the results of the intellectually coherent but politically extremely poorly timed Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review, or QDDR, which made a compelling case to me, unfortunately not to the House of Representatives, for deeper investments in civilian capacity. And what that means is, obviously we're never going to do anything like this again, because no administration would ever get us involved in something that would go this direction again. But if it were to do so, it would be Department of Defense that would again have to pick up the responsibility for an awful lot of civilian tasks. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Steve Biddle is known to many of you for his frequent, insightful commentary on Iraq and now Afghanistan. He's a senior fellow with the Council on Foreign Relations. When he had time to write a book, it was Military Planning, Military Power, Explaining Victory and Defeat in Modern Battle. I wonder if the next book will have to be explaining neither victory or defeat in modern battle. Steve, your insights as to where we are now.
Okay, thanks, Sam. I'd like to do two things, but I promise I'll stick to the time limit, so I may stop in the middle of the second one. The first one has to do with the kind of natural history of ideas about counterinsurgency as we go through a couple of these wars and start to think about structuring a military for what might come next. We've been through a pretty severe pendulum swing from a view early in the Iraq conflict that basically held that this was about violence, coercion, what the military refers to as kinetic activity. That was thought not to have worked out so well. And partly as a result of the publication of the new manual that John was so closely associated with, we then had a fairly comprehensive pendulum swing to the other end, where at least in intellectual circles where people were thinking about counterinsurgency as independent from the bureaucratics of any large institution to do it, the view swung hard over to an emphasis on hearts and minds, political development, governance reform. That, I think, reached its apogee in the early McChrystal years in Afghanistan, and I think has now radically spent. And we're in the process of swinging back to something very close to the early Iraq view that basically holds that success and failure in this kind of conflict, insurgency, wars on terrorists, is essentially a matter of killing. It's a matter of killing the right people, killing as few as possible of the wrong people, but all this business about nation building and governance reform is impossible, it's unachievable, we shouldn't do it, and instead we should focus on doing what we do right, which is drone strikes, special forces raids, small footprint training missions that are basically about teaching the local military to be more effective at the traditional military tasks. And I think we're in substantial danger of ending up in a significant violation of the Clausewitzian principles that I think most Americans in this community continue to emphasize. That if violence is to be a sensible means of statecraft, it has to be tied to some sort of political outcome. That you're using violence and you're killing people in order to create a political change of some kind somewhere. Now, the kind of unwashed, simplistic version of the Hearts and Minds School set up way too ambitious a set of political changes that is probably beyond the reach of any plausible American use of violence to accomplish in the developing world. That doesn't mean that it makes sense to simply use force or train other people to do it without some conception of what sort of political purpose or outcome or end state this is supposed to bring about. And I think we find this problem biting us hard today in Afghanistan, and we'll shortly see it biting us hard in Yemen, in Somalia, in Syria, and elsewhere. In Afghanistan, with the exception of an unrealistically ambitious view that the Bush administration held mostly implicitly, there's never been a clear articulation of what political outcome in Afghanistan we can live with. The Obama administration has been fairly clear that they thought their predecessors were after too much. They've never been very clear on how little we can settle for. And what's happened in practice without ever articulating that, and I don't think it's been articulated even on the inside, in addition to just public statements in the public square, is that we've gradually been retreating to an acceptance of less and less and less, without an argument about why this can still actually secure the aims that we have been fighting the war for. And I think we're in danger of very quickly, if we had not already, getting ourselves into a position where we backed into getting so little that it's no longer worth the sacrifice of lives and dollars that we're making in order to do anything at all. Now, I tried in a foreign affairs piece a couple of years ago that I co-authored with some much smarter folks than I, Fotini Christia and Alex Thier, to articulate what we thought the minimum acceptable political outcomes would be. I think as we go through this kind of inevitable pendulum swing from soft to hard approaches to counterinsurgency, ideally what you'd like is as you go through iteration after iteration after iteration, the amplitude of the swings would get smaller and the attention to kind of synthetic middle grounds would grow. And where I would like that attention to come to rest is an articulation of how can you relate smaller uses of force to real, meaningful, attainable political change in a theater that can actually meet the national interests of the nation that's using the violence, and especially us. And I'll just throw out one anecdote on this score before I shift grounds, and Sam's going to have to flag me or I'll go on too long. There's a fashionable view in DC at the moment that special forces raids and CT is all we really need in South Asia. And that's all we really need from Afghanistan. And as long as we can maintain bases, probably in the northern part of the country, to conduct these kinds of raids against high-value targets that we care about, that's all we really need. And we can live with whatever else happens around that. And I find it remarkable how infrequently Afghans' perspectives on this agenda are part of the conversation here. Most Afghans that I've talked to view this agenda as You Americans want to fly around at 10,000 feet, bomb people you don't like, while Afghanistan burns down underneath it. Why is there anything in this for us? And why should we help you? If that's all you care about, and what happens to us is of so little consequence, well, I'm not sure we're particularly interested in giving you the basis that you want to conduct these missions. If we don't think creating Switzerland and the Hindu Kush is obviously a silly ambition, and if anyone ever held it, they should have been impeached. But if we have no articulation of what political outcome we can live with, we're probably not going to get even the opportunity to engage in kinetic activity that so many in this town at the moment are focusing on almost to the exclusion of all of us. The intersection of what force can do to change politics is what this whole conversation has to be about, whether it's going to be about large footprint coin using hundreds of thousands of conventional troops, or whether it's going to be about drone raids and special forces 12-person teams training or targeting or killing or doing the collection of things that special forces do. It has to be about something or another that happens with respect to what we, at one time in Afghanistan, what governments reform or political change. Do I have any time left, or am I
Pretty much over with a little bit.
I was going to talk about the prognosis in Afghanistan. I'll only just flag that I have historically been guardedly optimistic, but in the optimistic camp on Afghanistan. And I am on the verge of becoming substantially pessimistic about the prognosis. And I'll just flag that.
Okay, we'll return to it.
We can return to it if people want, but I'll stop.
Thanks, Reed. Marvin Weinbaum, in our earlier discussions, alerted us to the reality that Afghanistan was, to a large extent, also Pakistan, or even maybe the problem of Afghanistan was the problem of Pakistan, essentially. And I wonder if that's still your position.
Well, it is. As it happens, it's not what I was going to talk about.
Okay.
But we can get into that.
Okay, all right.
Certainly.
Marvin is a scholar in residence at the Middle Eastern Institute in Washington, D.C., and an expert on Afghanistan as well as Pakistan.
Well, yeah, thank you. Well, I find myself, in a sense, having to take issue with Secretary Gates on a number of things, because I think there is a danger, and it's come out a bit in the discussions we've had thus far, that we could overlearn the lessons. You know, those lessons being, don't fight a land war in Asia, for this. We're not very good at nation building. Counterinsurgency was never really going to succeed. And then the last one that is part of the growing conventional wisdom, is that, after all, the Afghans are a tribal society, and a modern, certainly democratic state was really unachievable. Well, you know, just to take them very quickly in order. Obviously, as has already been pointed out here, this was not a war of choice here. Our response to 9/11, I believe, was an appropriate one. We had to take action in that theater. But what I want to stress is that the kind of caution that we're talking about here is caution we're going to have to exercise in any theater. The fact remains that with all of the talk of shifting to Asia, I, for one, think that we're not going to shift away very far from West Asia, right, as against East Asia. We're going to have find that our national interests are still very much tied up with what happens in Afghanistan and Pakistan and the subcontinent. After all, when we went in there with very modest obligations, objectives rather. In fighting this land war, we fought it from the beginning in the most minimal way. We tried to get by with air power. We put far fewer troops on the ground than later seemed wise. And certainly, I will debate anybody who talks about Afghanistan as being the graveyard of history. I think that history, examination of history does not show that at all. As far as state building is concerned, everyone talks about nation building, but of course we're talking about state. Yes, we cannot involve ourselves in nation building, but it never was about that. Afghanistan is a nation. Nations are about identity. State building is about building institutions, and I think we do have some capacity here. We shouldn't say that necessarily we don't. We may have made some mistakes. We made a number of mistakes in this area, but we can make a contribution here. My point here is that I don't think we did very well, but we didn't try very hard. It never, I think that the effort here in trying to build up a more secure and prosperous state never really got a fair trial. Okay, so this takes us, I think, to counterinsurgency. Look, it took us 9 years to decide that there was a close interrelationship here between what we were doing in terms of combating terrorism, as well as addressing governance and addressing economic improvement in the country, reconstruction. We did not appreciate that. I think we were, those basic elements, I would say, probably were and remained sound, but that whatever it was, when we got around to it, it was just too late. Or at least it made the job of succeeding here far more onerous than it would have been had we instituted some of the same objectives, some of the same strategies in 2004, as late as 2004 and 5. Naturally, once we established deadlines, this was also going to undermine the counterinsurgency, and we've heard a good many things here this afternoon about that, which I think I agree with. But I think most of all, the one that really bothers me here is, and I'm not saying that there aren't very good arguments here, but I'm saying let's not, in each case, sell short the fact that there was something to be said about pursuing, whether it was state building and counterinsurgency. But it's the one that says that the Afghans are really, it's a tribal society. They are basically xenophobic, and therefore this was never going to be possible. I just think it totally underestimates who the Afghans are and takes away from the fact that they're very rational actors. They have all the instincts of survival that are necessary, and they have pursued it in a rational way. The decisions that they've taken here reflect the fact whether it's because they may have to maintain a patronage system in order to keep it together, but whatever it is, they have not done things which reflect somehow some primitive notions here about governance. It was not to be expected here that we were going to be able to place in position here the institutions once much of the traditional institutions were wiped out by a war that began basically in 1978. But something happened among the Afghans, whereas in the past they looked at government as something to keep at a distance. As a result of their experiences in exile and experiences indeed under the communists as well, that they came to expect more from government. Yes, to try to institute a powerful central government was misguided, but I think that the basic notion here of democracy, where a people seek to determine their own destiny and want to hold their leaders accountable, are basic principles on which you can build in Afghanistan I think the rudiments, at least here, of a democratic society. How you do this, how you go about it, is still another matter. Finally, let me just say that lots of people have come in with views here about how some of these lessons here are just self-evident. We should have seen it, and we are going back, I think, what we've heard here, back to some things that we tried earlier, and expecting now they're going to work when they didn't work, when it was, I think, far more likely that we could have succeeded with those. But as Ron Newman has I think very correctly pointed out, Afghanistan is complex enough that anybody who looks at it can find something to justify their interpretation of how it should have turned out, how mistakes that we made. And so I think we have to be modest here as we go forward and recognize that a lot of the things that we did were at the time that they took place, seemed like very calculated, well thought out things, but so much of this is situational. And that I don't think, again, that we should sell short some of the things that we have gotten from this and not end up learning what is essentially the wrong lessons.
Thank you very much. I'd like to call on Vanda Felbab-Brown, who is a fellow in foreign policy at the Brookings Institution. Her work focuses on the interaction among illicit economies, criminal organizations, armed conflict. What else can we say about the correspondence between her interests in Afghanistan? Wanda.
Thank you. I had some trepidation going after Marvin because to call Marvin an expert on Afghanistan and Pakistan is probably the understatement of the year, where Marvin really is the father and godfather of Afghanistan and South Asia studies in the US, and certainly a mentor. But as it turned out, the switch, the handover, it actually works very well, because in many ways I think I'm going to endorse a lot of the stuff that Marvin said and connected with some of the comments that Steve made, starting with also connecting with some of John's comments, namely that the mood right now is never again. At the same time, however, the United States historically and even in the current period really struggles to develop the capacity to say no to invitationals that come up. John brought up Syria, and the drums are beating strong for an intervention in Syria at a time when Afghanistan is at the best and the most optimistic characterization, in my view, just barely sticking together, and in another interpretation, disintegrating. And yet, with the very unaccomplished outcomes in Afghanistan and still the pains of Iran, we are now ready to take on yet another very simple country. So this being sort of the historic capacity of us to say no and to really have a grand strategy, the core of which is not to say where we do engage, but at the core of which is to say where we will not get engaged. I want to emphasize the need not to forget some of the hard lessons, we don't call it, that were learned, and to deepen the knowledge of them. That said, I think we also need to be very realistic that many of the lessons that we learned hard, we were also never able to implement. We were not able to implement them certainly in Afghanistan, even as the strategic guidance or strategic interpretation of the conflict there, in my view, improved. We really struggled with developing, implementing some of the strategy on the ground, and we haven't accomplished it today. That said, I think one of the big misses of Afghanistan, and especially if it does end up bad and Afghanistan does fall apart, some months, years after 2014, would be to say that it was because we were too ambitious and because we tried to go into what was once again very much mislabeled nation building, as opposed to really understanding that where we really failed most fundamentally is governance. I would posit that we failed in the security security part of it, although this was to secure the population. We never ever in the conflict in Afghanistan secure the population. In fact, in many ways, we made the population far more insecure in various stages of the conflict. And even today, we are making them far more insecure by both changing the political balances and possibilities for accommodations, but as well by under-emphasizing or completely not calculating in how issues such as crime, for example, affect human security. So we have all the time measured security in some sort of notion of the intensity of the insurgent attacks, for example, or intensity of insurgent action, as opposed to looking at security through the eyes of the Afghan population, which I would define as the complexity with which they have to negotiate everyday transactions. So I don't think we ever accomplished that bit fully. But what we certainly failed to and kept systematically under-emphasizing is the bit of governance by becoming seduced by notions that Afghans don't want outsiders, that Afghans are tribal, that they will be used to central government, that this flight food approach is a way to go. But we fundamentally fractured whatever governance there was by our intervention, both the governance that the Taliban provided, but also other forms of governance, which essentially already were pretty much non-existent. The tribes were long gone to some extent. I don't want to play it too much, but before the interim. And the reason that the Taliban was able to take power in Afghanistan was precisely because other forms of governance were fractured. And instead, what we have settled them with is an increasingly, not simply corrupt, but increasingly capricious mafia rule that does not have any of the virtues of a mafia rule. Mafias can be very legitimate. The mafia in Sicily was for centuries a very legitimate entity that outcompeted in its legitimacy the Italian state. But it was not simply because it provided services that the state didn't provide, but critically because it provided order and assurance of transactions. Whereas what's happening with governance in Afghanistan today is not only that the government officials are abusive and that service delivery is minimal, but that there is extreme complexity and no assurance to transactions. Unless it is unfortunately the Taliban that at some point provides order. Yes, I very much agree with Marvin that Afghans crave for mechanisms of accountability. In fact, one of the most frequent words that strikes anyone who interacts with Afghans is the call for justice. And often they define it very different ways, or to some extent different ways than we do. Less from a formal process, perhaps, but in the form of what are appropriate behaviors and mechanisms of appropriate behaviors. But nonetheless, it is about justice and governance. And the current government, both at the highest level of the appellate, but in its local manifestation, is an increasingly capricious mafia rule of narrower and more exclusionary patronage network that are as much contested internally as they are dissatisfactory to the population. And then for us to assume that we can, as Steve very eloquently put it, simply bomb our way out of Afghanistan and be completely oblivious to what the interests and survival necessities of the Afghan population are either delusional or really assume that we can have no compliance, that we need no compliance of any sort, even from the Afghans to provide level of bases, even in the north. And we can talk about the different dynamics in the country. I don't want to get too much in any details. And so the one thing that I would urge is that if you do ever get involved, whether by design or simply because we cannot resist or because someone else pulls us in, that we cannot delude ourselves that we can wash our hands of government. That we can do some drive-by intervention by some military, however well-calibrated means and ignore the political side. And governance here, connecting with what Linda said, does not have to be necessarily a very Western notion of institutional setup, but it needs to be political arrangements that provide what the population sees as necessary for the ability to conduct everyday work. What people crave accountability might be across the board. Even in Somalia, people crave accountability. But what is most important for them is spreading And so an authoritarian, even brutal regime that nonetheless is predictable, and people can adjust their behavior to match the necessities of survival to those rules, is far easier than lot of chaos. And unfortunately, in Afghanistan, we are at the stage where in much of the country, the brutality of the Taliban era was still more predictable and easier to cope with than some of the capriciousness and rapaciousness that is once again taking place in the country. So let me conclude with two quite operational comments about that and what this means if we ever do it again. One aspect is that securing the population means being far better at dealing with crime and providing what police forces do. We are miserable at police reform. We haven't done it well in Haiti or Mexico, even just very sort of informal or hands-off assistance, and we have never done it in Afghanistan. It's a huge deficiency, not just ours, more broadly internationally, and developing expeditionary and effective training police capacity that focuses on crime, not counterinsurgency life, is critical for a whole host of projects. And of course that's linked to justice. It's even more difficult in some respects doing justice assistance than police and law enforcement assistance. And once again, it doesn't have to be resurrecting Western notions or Western processes, but it certainly means enabling dispute resolution mechanisms that are acceptable to the population. But we shouldn't fall to the trap to think that the traditional, the tribal might be there. We're making the same mistake in West Africa, in Nigeria with Boko Haram. We're assuming that tribalism rules there. Well, also the tribalism is gone. Even the third world is moving, it's connecting with the global world. And the problem is not that there are traditional structures, that there is enough, that modern institutions are paralyzed, not functioning, corrupt, or present, and the old have gone. And my final comment is that that we should also not fall trap into the very difficult and constantly present dilemma or trap of taking shortcuts on the battlefield that we think bring immediate relief of the acuteness of the military heat and sacrificing the governance with political thinking. Well, let's say, no, in the medium term it will happen. But the medium might very well kill it in the short term.
Thank you very much. Now, General Scales, with these various insights, some of them competing, these uncertainties as to what is going to happen in Afghanistan, different evaluations. We still need to do military planning, still have to deal with budgetary issues. What are the implications for where we are now in that kind of effort? What are the implications from these conflicts?
Thank you, Sam. First of all, wow, graduate course in national security strategy. Well, if we limited it, all of us to 5 minutes, we could get a new PA in a week and probably be better for it. This was really good. Secondly, I'd like to apologize to Michael. He mentioned that we had dueling op-eds in the Washington Post back in January, and I never called him. The reason was that I was listening to the President's speech that morning as I drove to take a cruise out of Bayonne. I got so pissed off at his statement that he wasn't going to ignore the lessons of history that went immediately into crass ahistoricism. That I got in my cabin and I started banging out this op-ed that you and I submitted the next day, and my internet went dead. And as the Caldwell was trying to break in, as we're going up to do our what do you call it, lifeboat drill and all that stuff, as we're going underneath the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, I finally sent the thing to Fred Hyde at the Post. And then, sadly, Michael, I spent the next 12 days drinking Mai Tai and chasing Diana across the poop deck, and I wasn't able to, I didn't actually see that you and I were going mano a mano until I got back about 12 days later and started digging through all my copies of the Post. But my point is, I know, where am I going with this?
It was fun.
Well, it was fun, and again, I apologize for my talking, but I enjoyed the poop deck. But back to the theme, which I just stated badly, was the ahistoricism of the future gazing that this administration and others have traditionally done. This is a deal that's happened before. We're reverting to type. And I'll play on Steve's point about about focus on killing. The new strategy appears to be focus on killing with steroids. And if you look about what's next, what I see coming out of the administration as we look at the future of military structuring programs, is this so-called pivot to Asia, which to me is a frantic attempt to find a nail for the air-sea battle hammer. You know, anytime anyone tells you that it's not about the money, it's about the money. And anytime anybody tells you that it's not about China, it's about China. And the frantic disabusal of this administration is saying, no, 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 as the Secretary of Defense rings China, like Truman ring the Soviet Union in these trips and saying, no, no, it's not about China. Someone needs to talk to the Chinese about that because they certainly think it is. The other silly declaration is this is a joint future strategy that's focused around all the services. No, it's not. Just take a look at the latest apology in Armed Forces Journal by an Air Force and a Navy colonel, captain and colonels, I believe, where there was a brief head nod towards jointness and all the rest was about whacking the Chinese with missiles and bombers. Really what this does, I'm afraid, is that we're reverting to type. You know, pick your post-war strategies, whether it's Eisenhower's New Look or the global reach in the 1970s, the RMA in the 1990s, the gift of time in the late 90s. It's just the typical reversal of the American national security strategy back to its default position, which is revulsion and having just fought a manpower intensive war and a commitment to fight a techno-centric war. And simply they're trying, now that we're trying to rebuild the hammer, we're desperately trying to find a nail. And the only one that comes to mind that's politically acceptable is China. To John's point earlier about when he was on C-SPAN, and he said that both Republicans and Democrats, conservative and liberals, all said the first thing we've got to do is not do this. So this is simply a way to craft a national security strategy that focuses on a sweet spot, which is winning wars with technology and firepower. And it's been accelerated, to my mind, by several recent events. First was the crushing of Libya by air power. Second was this terrorist plinking campaign with drones that Steve just talked about, which is, I think, appears to be deceptively successful. And of course, the recent leaked cyber campaign against Iran. You stack all these up, add to a populace in an election year desperate to find a new way to pivot. This is the new way to pivot, because everybody knows we're going to fight China. They're not going to fight China. The Chinese know that. But this is a great way to restart the national security strategy, focus on technology, and focus on an enemy that everybody knows that we're not going to fight. So, what does this mean? Well, it means that, back to Steve's point about clauses, that the ends determine the means. This is exactly what Vanda just said. That when Barbara rolls over to George and says we can't let these people suffer anymore, or when we watch the news media about Syria and Michelle rolls over to Iraq and says we can't suffer this anymore, we're going to go to war. And we're going to go to war with an unexpected outcome because we don't understand the ends and we restrict the means. So, you know, Truman couldn't find Korea on a map before the 20th of June 1950. Johnson had no idea we'd suffer 61,000 dead. And I could go on, and who knew that we'd be fighting a decade of war after 9/11. So what we have, I think, is a couple of things. Technocentric approach to national security strategy, and this obsession with trying to put everything in neat bundles called scenarios. It doesn't work. We have a terrible record for picking the time, the place, the circumstances, and most specifically, the enemy. So, okay, Bob, now that you've disabused the national security strategy, how do we do it? I would suggest to you, back to my point with Michael in during op-eds, that we have to take, dare I say it, more of a long-term historical approach to our national security strategy. That in fact, and it should be driven not by what our ends are, but frankly what our enemies' ends are. Where's the consistency in all of this? The consistency is wherever the enemy has approached us as we have lived through the American era of warfare. Whoever the enemy has been, from high end in Korea, middle end in Vietnam, low end in Iraq and Afghanistan, our enemies have pursued exactly the same national security strategy from Lin Piao to Mao Zedong to Saddam Hussein and Ho Chi Minh. That is to limit the effectiveness of American firepower, to fight a non-technical war that reduces the options of America's technocentric style of warfare, at the operational level, to hide, to go to ground, to use disinformation as a weapon, and propaganda as a defensive strategy, with the outcome of winning by not losing and forcing us to get tired of it and go home. And that has been the way we fought wars, major wars, every time since the end of World War II. So how do you do it? Well, you build a national security strategy, I believe, around the enemy's capabilities, not your own. That you focus force structures in the future around a strategy that assumes we will do again what we've done in the past. Now, that runs counter to what we're going to do, and we're going to do it anyway. Just as we built B-52s, we're going to build BXs in the decade. And whoever we face in the future, First Lady rolls over to the President and says, we have to help those people. We're going to go to war with what we have, and it's going to be inadequate, and soldiers and Marines are going to die needlessly, and bombers are going to orbit helplessly over the battlefield seeking to intrude very effectively because the enemy knows what he's doing. I would suggest to you that if you want to view a possible national security strategy that might work, that you read Frank Hoffman and Dave Johnson's work on hybrid warfare. It comes the closest to my mind to understanding the enemy's future capabilities in its purest and most abstract form, and it's certainly understandable to the man in the street. This idea of going back to the RMA in order to kill from a distance bloodlessly, I think is patently absurd. Not that I have strong feelings on it, but I've done it in 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. We'll open it up for general discussion for those of you who are here. I will, however, preface this by a comment in reaction to what we just heard. And that is, one can look at the present situation as simply continuity with what U.S. struggles in national security policy and defense planning have been. Or one can look at what has just happened. We've been through 2 conflicts, not finished with them yet, as producing a major discontinuity. The second proposition is the one that I would suggest, going back to my original comments, we ought to seriously consider, and that is whether or not there has in fact been a major souring on the use of force by the United States to engage in operations that have as their objective the changing of the political systems in other countries. It appears to me that we were in an era, or getting into an era, immediately after post 9/11, when that was the a principal definition of what the United States was about in the world. The last decade and the experience of Iraq and Afghanistan, it appears to me, has shattered that, has changed it in a very substantial direction, changed the notion and the support within the policy community as well as within the general public that the United States has an obligation to intervene in other countries to affect the political complexion in those countries. Now, John is shaking his head.
Seyom, I don't know if you remember Libya, but we have recently intervened, right? And so, quick story. A Republican friend of mine told me that he was arguing with a Democratic friend of his before the last presidential election. And his Democratic friend told him, if you vote for John McCain, we're going to go to war with another Muslim country. And the Republican said, and the guy was exactly right. I voted for John McCain, and we went to war with another Muslim country. So Seyom, I'm sorry, but we've got very recent historical experience that contradicts you.
But the official definition of why we're doing it by the president was that we're not engaged in a regime change operation.
Oh, I have to, as much as it pains me, I have to agree with John on this. I think all we're doing is just stretch out the timeline to some degree before we do this again. I mean, I believe in the epochal shifts in history, the cycles change, and I think that the United States will be at it again as soon as memories fade. And the other thing I'll say, and trust me, I'm a soldier and I have fought our nation's wars, and I have great respect for the sacrifices our soldiers and Marines have made over the last 10 years. But when you get around to it, the truth is, with the exception of possibly Korea and Vietnam, we really haven't fought. We haven't really fought on the battlefield, at least. We really haven't fought combat. This hasn't been that hard. It's been expensive, it's been frustrating, it's certainly for the American people been tiresome. But the American people, about a year to a year and a half ago, pretty much discounted Afghanistan. When I first started in the news business, we were doing 60 to 65% of our discretionary time on wars at Fox News. Now it's less than 4%. It's over. So for someone to say, wow, that was hard, we'll never do that again. The American people said it in 1954, certainly said it in 1973. I know we said it in 1972. But you know what? We're America. And just like 19th century Britain, we still view ourselves as the guarantor of global security. And when it happens again, we'll go to war with the military we have at the time. And we'll forget about the ends, and we'll take the means we have, and in all probability we'll survive.
Let's open it up to general comments and discussion. Anyone? Yes.
Is there a microphone or no? Use my command voice. Jason Campbell, I'm with RAND. I myself just had an opportunity to do some research in Afghanistan, and one question I put to a lot of mid and senior level officers was, what does the security of force assistance mission look like that we're transitioning to this fall? And probably unsurprising to many in this room that I got a lot of different answers. And I'd like to put it to the panel. I'm going to have trouble, I think, with a lot of people in this room are in directing my question to any one panelist, but I put it to you to what do you think it will look like, and what should it look like as we move forward into the fall?
Anyone?
I will take the first crack at this because I think it is a very good question, and I think it's proving difficult, frankly, because we have now had this decade where brigades are focused on being the combat lead, and to pivot to being an advisor, a combat advisor, is a very different thing. And you fill your army with type A individuals, and they want to be in the lead, and their own. And my big concern is that unless you really change how those individuals are evaluated as part of their personal career path, and your mission at the end of your tour is have you put your partner unit in the lead. It doesn't really matter how perfectly they're doing the job, but are they in the lead? And if you have not done that, you should not get a satisfactory evaluation. And I know personally one of the best and brightest brigade commanders out there at the end of his tour was focused on how many air assaults had he done. And so I think that this is actually a change that has to happen. And if you don't mind, I'll just take this to segue into another point, because we have construed the small footprint part of the new Defense Strategic Guidance as meaning, I think, a CT only. And I don't think that is what it should be. And I'm not entirely sure. That document has a lot about building partner capacity. And what I would add is employing partner capacity. It's not just building partner capacity, so that we're force multiplier for those countries that are really solving their own problems in the ideal world. So I think that there's a lot to critique in that strategy, but I think that if you talk to actual thoughtful individuals trying to prosecute these campaigns, they understand we have to get that partner nation and host nation in the lead.
But I suggest to you the problem with that is, I think the Army and the military has done very well at the tactical and perhaps small operational level, just what you said. I think that the mindset among our captains and majors, lieutenant colonels and colonels is just that. I think where we fail is in the strategic level. And for any number of reasons, selection to hire staffs, the gleaning that goes on by the Paul Mill community on who they really want to be in uniform, the recent, Muslims not the right word, but the recent pressure on the military at the strategic level to offer unfettered strategic advice, I think actually in the long term may do us more harm than good. But I will say, what I saw in Iraq and Afghanistan and what you've written about, Linda, is that we have made remarkable progress at the lower and mid-level leadership positions. We have a long way to go.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a disagreement over what the security force assistance mission means in Afghanistan. I think ISAF is going to interpret it to mean something very close to what it's doing right now. I mean, there will be a change in the proportion of American and ANA units on patrols, a change in the march order. They'll be in the front, we'll be in the rear. But I think in terms of the op tempo, how much time platoons and companies spend outside the wire, and I think in terms of casualty exposure, how much time they spend in contact with the enemy, I strongly suspect that ISAF will be advocating a model of security force assistance that looks very much like operations today. I mean, after all, since General McChrystal's time, partnering has been one of the central concepts driving the campaign plan and for the purpose of building up the ANSF. So I think what you're going to see from the command in theater is an argument that, yes, we've changed the mission and it looks exactly like the old mission. I think what you're going to see from the NSC is going to be a pretty aggressive push to interpret security force assistance, and I'm going to caricature it, but it hasn't been articulated yet, so the caricature is arguably fair. Security force assistance as fob-bound classroom instruction. With a minimum of operations outside the wire, a minimum of casualty exposure, a maximum of reliance on the Afghans to solve their own problems, whatever may come. And you know, I think there's going to be a tug of war with the degree of civil-military friction that we've become accustomed to recently over just what this thing means. Now, in terms of what it should mean, I think to some extent this depends on your view of the prognosis. I don't want to take the excuse to say what I didn't have time to say before, but let me I will say.
That's not a much.
I will say though that I think at this point the marginal contribution of American combat activity to the outcome is not decisive to what happens here. And I am much more sympathetic than I ever thought I would be to an interpretation of security force assistance that involves radically reduced casualty exposure. Because whatever we do between now and 2014, we are going to be handing over a stalemated war. There is no conceivable program of operations for any American force structure that is going to remain in this theater that is going to clear all Taliban-held territory from Afghanistan, or even from parts of Afghanistan that IGC has identified as critical terrain. Nor do I think it's reasonable to expect that the ANA is going to be able to do clearance operations on its own in 2014. You can debate what they're capable of. I think the upper bound of plausible projections is that they'll be able to hold things that we have cleared for them, but that I have yet to hear anybody put a case to me that I find persuasive that they're going to be able to do clearance. So in 2014, when we hand off, whether we do a bunch of new clearance operations or major offensives in RCE, or we don't do another one from tomorrow forward, either way, there is going to be a significant volume of Taliban-held territory in Afghanistan, especially but not exclusively in Regional Command East, and the ANA is not going to be able to reduce it. So the strategic problem of Afghanistan after 2014 amounts to how do you terminate a stalemated war on grounds that can respect the political interests that we're fighting the war for? Whether the stalemate is 10% more terrain in our hands or 10% less terrain in our hands between now and 2014 is about a seventh order consideration in that. But to hold 10% more territory by 2014 is going to kill some Americans who would otherwise live, raise children, lead lives. And I don't see the stake of changing 10% of the territorial control of the country before we enter into the stalemate phase to be worth that. And I suspect that the White House probably feels similar.
I think Steve is right unless Pakistan changes course. I think that's ultimately strategically decisive. I'd be interested in Marvin's thoughts on how likely that is. Good luck figuring out Pakistan, even for him, the Pasha of Pakistan, as Vanda said. The one sort of thing I'd add, a level of detail that I'm immersed in, what those brigades, what those advisory, what we've done is taken real live Army combat brigades of about 5,000 troops, essentially taken all of the private soldiers out of them. And so 4th Brigade of the 1st Armored Division, which I've been working with, is sending about 600 folks out of those 5,000 on an advisory mission to Afghanistan. And so that very small number of troops and the fact that those staff sergeants and up aren't really trigger pullers, they're really managers of violence rather than implementers of violence themselves, does mean that I think to see what it's going to look like, you go back and read Jim Wilbank stuff and the stories of the advisors during the Easter Offensive, and you're going to see a lot of Americans on a lot of radios calling in an awful lot of airstrikes, which is contrary to the new agreement that John Allen just signed this week. But that's the direction I think we're going to go.
Following on actually the airstrike issue that triggers his comment, I think it's going to be a three-way tug of war, not simply the White House versus the military, but increasingly the Afghans. And increasingly I would argue that for a variety of political dynamics, the Afghan political pressure will not be congruent with our best notion of how to conduct the transition and how to insert it for that matter. And the classroom education on the thought would be something that would be extraordinarily appealing to President Caldwell and a bunch of people around him, not necessarily Minister Wardak, but a good number of people. And we have to understand that our leverage is going to be declining, and the rate of decline will pick up every day from now on until 2014. But at the same time, we are going to also be in the sort of last minute thrust to get as best an outcome out of the stalemate war. And the stalemate would, I think, at this point look like a good outcome. And so we're going to be doing things that you are very well aware, Jason, that you have worked a lot on, like the ALP. And of course, the idea that the ALP was at all controllable and technically usable was predicated on the idea that we'll have this thick embedded and monitoring. The more we push the numbers with lessening presence, the lesser the chance that we'll either be not led by the nose by the ALP, or that it will not turn out into itself a source of trigger and trigger of conflict and significant worsening of governance. And I would add on that is that beyond the military, the Afghan military role under the best circumstances clearing that minimum holding, I mean, we are already seeing circumstances where neither ISAF nor Combo and ISAF and Afghan forces can hold even in the north because we cannot bring in sufficient evidence. So it's hold, new conflict, some sort of disintegration, and that's even in the far easier north. Arya, Bagan, and Kunduz, the toughest places in the north, but even there, And I think it's a big question mark in many of the areas where we are supposedly holding. To what extent the holding is the result of our antagonistic capacity, and to what extent it is a waiting game that is going on the market. Not just the Taliban, but the variety of actors that can pull the trigger on conflict.
Further
If we had been able to put the surges in earlier in the conflicts in either or both wars, would it have made a strategic difference in what we're predicting now as the outcome for the future? It seems to me that Rumsfeld did not anticipate what happened and wanted to keep this small technological force. And that went on for 4 years before we got any surge there. And Obama sent in a minimal amount of surge forces and started pulling them out before they even got there. And now has speeded that up. And he doesn't seem to have any real enthusiasm for this project, and never has articulated any kind of enthusiasm or message about why it was necessary to be there to the American public.
If I can start, yeah, I would say the answer is yes. And it was not true. I would say that the critical determinant, at least in the case of Afghanistan, I don't claim any knowledge of Iraq at all, was that it was not a war that was bound to be lost. The war could have been won if the policies early on were correct. And one of the critical aspects was not Lightfoot approach supposedly because Pashtun are congenitally anti-Western and anti-State, but was from that moment the inability to secure the population. And from that moment, empower actors who could be perpetually making the population insecure. So if we had gone heavy at that point, that would have made a big difference. If the heavy force meant enabled security, if it's just heavy force just to kill people without security, then obviously that doesn't help. But that heavy presence would not have been sufficient if it was deserved, if it was divorced from any notion, Afghan informed notion of what acceptable political arrangements can be. But I definitely want to say that it was not an effort that was bound to go wrong. It was a war that we made go wrong.
We left a vacuum, really. And there was a vacuum there, which ultimately local commanders filled. It's true that the central government was not in a position to act, but we needed some stabilizing force throughout the country. And we made a deliberate decision that we were going to have this light footprint and that we were going to focus mainly on counterterrorism at the borders. So we never really know, but what we know certainly is that the failure to do that created a dynamic inside Afghanistan, which ultimately affected the very potential here for more effective governance.
If I could make 2 more comments, I would also make the case that broadly beyond Afghanistan, there is a big window of opportunity early on in the immediate post-conflict, quote-unquote post-conflict moment, where there is most of the destabilization of the opposition that works in power. But that window closes down very rapidly. And the more time elapses, the more there is re-emergence with the recreational creation of new power and economic networks that are far better informed, far more entrenched, and often far more complex than the intermediate can ever hope to. So if you are serious about the project of building a counterinsurgency or doing regime change, you need to be ready to go in very early with very robust force. The more you wait, the harder it is, and at some point the window might just close no matter what you can go out, or you cannot reverse the dynamics.
Will any administration ever acknowledge this or use it?
I know you want to comment on this, but I want to just put on this to you also. Do you think that in the near future, any administration, whether it's a Romney administration or a second administration, is going to want to go in and recommend going into a situation in which we do full-blown counterinsurgency with the requisite size and power of forces required to
good to try to answer those questions together because I'd actually be curious if Vanda and Marvin and others agree with me. But I think in 03, 04, 05 in Afghanistan, we actually had a choice that was sort of the Goldilocks option. We didn't have to think of it as the time you had to surge 100,000 US troops, I don't think. But we did, if you go back to that time period, what we did was so minimalist. I mean, it's incredible. I remember General McChrystal told me in 2009, the number of police in the Afghan forces at that time who had any training, even 2 weeks, was about 25% of the force. Typical approach in the first 6 years was grab somebody off the street, give them a gun, give them a uniform, give them $50 a month. Actually, you give that through their corrupt commander. So we were doing everything wrong. And there was probably quite a bit of hard political work we needed to do that. I'm not sure there was an easy political strategy, but I do think there was an intermediate level coin strategy, more along the lines of what John Nagl's written about for a lot of years, sort of an intensive kind of mentoring. I think the security forces could have been built up much more assertively without 100,000 NATO troops at that time because the security environment was relatively benign. That's my interpretation. Now to combine that with your question looking forward, I doubt whether that's true in Syria or whether it will be true in Syria at any time. Therefore, I would predict we will never do anything decisive in Syria under any president. And I think Syria is likely to get a lot worse before it gets better. We'll probably take sides in a civil war at some point. I don't think, there are people trotting out the Kosovo analogy a little bit, and I love Anne-Marie Slaughter, but I didn't like her op-ed the other day because I thought it sort of trivialized the military challenges of doing this thing right. And the military challenges of doing this right are enormous. So my prediction would be we'll fight proxy war as we feel there's no other choice, and it'll be messy and just get worse, and nobody's going to do something decisive because there is no mid-level option for Syria, and we're not in the mood to put in another 200,000 troops into the Middle East. Steve?
Yeah, we'll make that the last comment.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm not normally a big fan of small footprint approaches, but I think if you're going to find a scenario where one would have made sense, the earlier years in Afghanistan is probably it. The standard counterfactual argument is if we had just sent 100,000 troops, as in fact the Army wanted to do, but Rumsfeld refused, then we would have secured the place, we would have faced an insurgency. I think we would have, in fact, faced an insurgency, but it would have been the kind that Rumsfeld was afraid of when he vetoed that large troop request. The American presence in Afghanistan as it existed at the time was essentially invisible, tiny, and very hard for Afghans to see or be aware of. If we had put a large presence designed to secure the population from an insurgency that was invisible, that was busy trying to lick its wounds and rebuild itself in Pakistan across the border and had no meaningful presence in Afghanistan, that big American presence would have delayed the Taliban's ability to field a meaningful threat within Afghanistan. And we would have had years and years and years of a large, visible, intrusive American presence with no apparent security purpose in a country that is a nation and has understood itself to be a nation for a long time. And I think that's the kind of scenario that does lead to insurgencies of resistance to foreign occupation. I think building up an Afghan national security force instead would have made more sense. The trouble is if you do that just as a military undertaking, if you send the Green Berets, you tell them train up a lot of soldiers, you cut the checks to pay their salaries, and you don't do anything else, you're in danger of creating an instrument that causes more harm than it does good. This is where some program of state building or a political agenda is necessary in order for the use of force to yield a result that can stabilize the country and serve the interests of either the United States or Afghanistan. Treating this solely as a military problem, 100,000 troops versus 5,000 SOF training an Afghan military that's to do the job instead, isn't going to work it. And arguably the single biggest problem in the political decay of the country was when Karzai became convinced after 2003 that American political and economic support of his regime had been pulled in favor of the adventure in Iraq, and that he was being given the second team, the second string in the form of NATO, and he began a program of deliberate warlord outreach that has led to the kind of predatory, well, not created it, but radically worsened the problem of predatory governance that we've faced since then. If we had a political strategy in place at the time that could combine some degree of support for building an indigenous military was some degree of political support for a government that felt beleaguered, and then sustained it over time, arguably that might have left us without the kind of war that we face now. But I don't think 100,000.
Yeah, but that's a stretch. I just think that's a stretch.
You could very easily have ended up where we are now anyway. But I think if you simply did what is the fashionable counterfactual now, and sent 100,000 troops, you would very likely end up worse off than we are right now.
But the impulse to do something, whether it's in Syria or someplace in North Africa, Middle East, Pakistan, is always with us. The real question is how much wisdom do we apply to that before we go blundering into some region of the world that we can't attract ourselves from.
Where my co-editor and I differ is that I think that the impulse to do something has drastically declined as a result of these two conflicts. Now, John doesn't agree.
John
Bob
King
doesn't agree. But
See, I have a point on that. Bob, I wanted to follow up your point about what Seyom is referring to and just look at some of the statistics of 6,500 Americans killed in these two wars, 35,000 very seriously injured, many of whom would have died even in Vietnam. And then the VA estimates that about 20% of the 2 million who have served have PTSD, 7% have traumatic brain injuries. And I know that those are...
Hold on.
No.
I'm not, as I said, I'm not minimalizing the sacrifice of the military. You've just described the total sacrifice, all taken together, which constitutes less than 1% of the American people.
Sure.
American population. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying, look, let me tell you, my friend, within my inner circle, the sacrifices have been tragic, and we will see it for a generation, and I can write and talk for hours about the sacrifice of it. What I'm telling you is that, to Seyom's point, the greater perspective of the American people, the 310 million people who watch TV every night, this has not been a sacrifice. This has not been a national sacrifice.
I'm not criticizing you, Bob.
I know you're not,
Point
but I'm trying. I don't want to walk away with people thinking that I'm saying
the point
this
I'm
is
getting to is that there is a more widespread recognition of injuries that were not recognized in previous wars. You know, shell shock in World War II was essentially PTSD. Right. And my point is that the more widespread recognition of those previously unrecognized wounds, mental and physical, may lead to a stronger opposition to these sorts of interventions in the future. So I don't think we're...
But let me just counter that one very quickly. As long as the American, in fact, John, as long as the American people view the commitment of military forces as something we pay for in terms of our taxes or whatever, and something we buy, rather than something we commit to, then the propensity to do what John just says, I think, goes up. That the American people may not like the commitment of forces to Libya or Syria or pick your intrusion, Pakistan, but as long as it's really no fault, as long as my son or now daughter doesn't have to go, then while the pain and suffering within my social group has been extraordinary and extreme, the overall societal price that we paid for the last 10 years is fairly minimal. Then I think that shortens the timeline before the American people say the starving people of X, we've got to do this again. That's all I'm saying. And my sense is, as a historian, not a political scientist, is that the flash to bang time between that is a lot shorter than I think Seyom really realized.
John, one sentence on that. The American people may not be in favor of continued involvement in Afghanistan, but it's not a top 10 issue for them. Right. The level of intensity is very, very low. And the big difference, and I actually, the Vietnam generation, a lot of the Vietnam generation, the folks who lived through that have a hard time believing that the U.S. can remain engaged in war for 10 years and keep going. And the night and day difference of an all-volunteer force, which does just what Bob just said, disconnects the American people from the real price that's being paid, the lack of tax increases to pay for it, means that America is disconnected from these wars. America as a whole, this I think is Bob's point, America as a whole has not paid a price for those wars. And as a result, the barrier to entry for next time is so low that we've crossed it again back in Libya, and there's every chance that we're going to cross it again soon.
I want to thank all of you very much for participating in this, and I do want to call attention to the book, by the way, in which each of the authors that you've heard here have contributed very thoughtful pieces. And also it has this amazing characteristic of Bob Scales and I both signing our interpretive pieces, even though we, as you discovered here, may disagree with each other on some fundamental issues. How we did that in itself will be, I think, very interesting to you. And the other pieces in the book, by Linda, by Vanda, by Marvin, by Dan, by Steve, and by Mike, as well as by Rob Litkoff, who's not here, I think are worth reading today, even though they were written some 5 months ago. I think that the issues that we got into and some of the details as well as the structure of argument is which you only got the surface of today, only had a surface exposure today, I believe is well worth the read, and I do recommend that you do so. Thank you all very much for coming.